Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second monologue in the Imperialism series. First of all, I have to say I was taken aback and, in a good way, and pleased by the amount of traction or engagement that the previous Imperialism video attracted. I'm not sure why, but nevertheless, I appreciate it, especially the breadth of the audience um, from Europe, the UK. Um, the US, Australia. Whenever I talk about imperialism or settler colonialism, I always appreciate input from Australia and the US and Canada. Um, Now, the second part of imperialism is that as much as my first video was trying to make people understand what imperialism was, um, and by and large, that I managed to get that across. But one thing that escapes people again is to recognizing the sort of shape shifting that imperialism has done over the past 100 years or so, because it's a structure and it was based on empires. That's what its origin was. Later on, now it's a structure that's not based on geographical empires. It's based on commercial empires or capitalism and certain classes of people that are not necessarily of noble birth, although some of them are, but largely it's a class that's defined by oligarchy or capitalism, and it's what a friend of mine, Stanley Macharia, calls the predatory billionaire class. They're definitely the predator class. If I can borrow from ecology. There's a word we often hear, especially since some of us we've obviously had it for many years, but most of the world will have had a lot of it since in the last 3 years since war broke out in Ukraine. Something called the world order. It's a euphemism, but to me, it's one of the most frightening things I hear. And what's frightening to me, especially, is the way it is accepted. You hear it used on the BBC, you hear it used on CNN, you hear it used and accepted in media in widespread way. And it's a very frightening term because it's not an accountable term. It's not a term that is based on human achievement or content of character or the good things that edify human society. It is totally arbitrary. Now, let's look at current imperialism. The world has gone through a number of fractures over time. Um, I've said in one of my monologues before that civilization in Europe is only 80 years old, and that's defined by World War II. That sort of fighting, genocide, etc., cannot happen in a civilized society. So let's start 1945. 1945, as a result of World War II, defined the so-called superpowers. Um, the Eastern Bloc, the Western Bloc led by the United States. Um, Later on, NATO, the sort of Western alliance in Europe. And 1945 also produced a number of institutions that were supposed then looked like good, they looked like safeguards, but they were safeguarding the so-called world order or the new imperialism that was not geographical but economical. These institutions, key amongst them was the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, and most of all, the UN. The UN is an instrument of Western hegemony. It's not. It's a useless contradiction of so many different things. But I'll come to that later. Now, when after World War II, shortly after that, there came the advent of of independence in Africa and African countries. If I and I say independence in quotes because it's what the musician Lucky Dube referred to as a Mickey Mouse independence. In Kenya, my country, we had something called the Lancaster House talks with the the colonial British colonial office invited a number of leaders from Kenya, leaders from Kenya to go sit in Lancaster House and in London and negotiate the terms of independence. They were tribal leaders. They were picked according to tribes, and that's where our tribalism started in Kenya. For the Kenyans, Lancaster House is where it started, and it was defined by the British, not us. So they went there, and basically they sat at a table and they were told that okay, we want to bring about independence. There's this fraction of the pie we have been eating because colonialism was a capitalist enterprise. They didn't come here because they loved Kenya or they loved us or whatever. They came for resources. So they'd been eating and looting for years. So they picked these individuals. They wanted to create a local elite to replace them because imperialism depends on a hierarchical structure. So they needed local whites to replace the whites who are departing so that imperialism can continue even though on paper Kenya will be called independent. The things they needed to retain control of were things like our mineral resources, which they still do. They retain control of our tea industry, which they still do. Retain control of our conservation sector, national parks, and tourism, which they still do up to now. So they invited these tribal leaders there, and they sat there and they were told, so we want you to support, we want you to be, what do you want from this cake? We can give you a piece. What do you want? I want land, I want this job, I want this, I want that, I want that, I want shares in this or that, the other. So these guys negotiated, then they took photos there. If you look online for the photos of the Lancaster House talks and the delegates, they're all dressed in these they're all dressed like props in a play, these tribal costumes and all that do not mean anything out there. And today you still see it. When Prince William convenes his Tusk Award ceremony, you see all these Maasai people in their beadwork and all that. In international conservation conferences, you see the representatives of indigenous people all dressed in these colorful costumes, but not serving any interests of their people. That's an aside. But back to Kenya. So this changeover happened. Let's call it a changeover because that's what it happened. What it was. Um, we created a cabal of false revolutionaries, and their first job after taking over was to repress, silence, and otherwise sideline the real revolutionaries. And there were some. But fast forward to that, this was a very tenuous fabric that was woven in Kenya, called this country called Kenya. In fact, I saw an interview where Dr. Lukoya Tuoli said the biggest problem with Kenya is that it's founded on a lie. Nothing, I've never had a more elegant description of the edifice called Kenya. And fast forward now, so because this fabric was so false, it's like poorly woven, it's like poorly stitched shirt. It occasionally needs repairs, it comes apart at the seams or whatever. And these have manifested as periodic ethnic, first of all, the ethnicization of our politics, then okay, periodic skirmishes either between politicians and even communities. And they're always, every single one is addressed through the Lancaster House method. Call the people who are wronged or the different protagonists, put them at the table and hand out goodies. IPPG parliamentary talks, this was the inter-parties parliamentary group during Moi's days, led by Gilo Falana. Handouts. Later on, towards the end of Moi's rule, when his reputation was really sullied, the National Democratic Party, led by Raila Odinga, positioned itself, talks, handouts, merger, some positions, etc. That's how it kept happening. Things, and these handouts included positions, included even lands and businesses, etc., etc. So that's how it's gone on. Fast forward to today, there are many others you can look at in history. Fast forward to today. Last year we had some pretty violent protests in Kenya over taxation, the taxation regime. Again, a meeting, call some people who are perceived as leaders, give them some few handouts and hope it will go away. Like the Lancaster House method. Didn't happen. Again, we had protests this year. And again, they're already calling for something called a conclave. Again, it's just another Lancaster House. Look for some people. Isn't that, now they want to expand it to every county, collect, I think, 40 youth from every county. So they're trying to they're trying to cover up the real problem. The problem is not that people's youth. The problem is not ethnicities. The problem is poor governance and a population that has suddenly woken up. So what they choose to do is anything except improve the governance, because improving the governance would be to weaken the palace that is imperialism. And even those who are outside of government and want to get in, they want to get into the palace. They don't want to demolish the palace. So that's why even just a couple of days ago, the former deputy president suddenly tells the youth who are protesting, okay, now you need to stop protesting, stop agitating so much. Let's stop and have dialogue. I can't believe how myopic our political elite are. He's actually imagining that they care what he thinks about what they're protesting. They're protesting about overtaxation, lack of opportunities, etc. They were not waiting for his instruction. They didn't start protesting on his instructions, and they won't stop on his instructions either. But you can see he got worried. I'm trying to take over this palace, and these youth seem like they're ready to demolish it or burn it down. So I need to get them to somehow stop. That's imperialism for you. And whenever the palace is threatened, what the imperialists, the oligarchs, the elites, the billionaires, the predatory class, what they do is close ranks, regardless of political parties. And one of the things we have to become wary about is political parties, and we still need to start treating them with the sort of contempt they deserve. Because there's an example from Kenya. If you look at what's going on in the United States now, we have two main political parties, and it's it's um, it's one of the jokes around for those of us in other countries, how a country can call itself a leader in democracy when they've only got space for two political parties. But as I said, political parties are just different walls of the palace. There's one shouting from the east facing wall, one shouting from the west facing wall, one shouting and throwing handouts from the north facing wall, and the same from the south facing wall. So if you look at some of the promises that political candidates make in order to get into power, some of them get perilously close to promising, making promises to burn down the palace from the inside. Elect this palace is bad. Elect me. I'll even start demolishing from the inside, as you guys do. Once you get in there, back off, back off. You just start telling people back off because you are in the east side, but it's the palace. We need to be in this palace, and you see it with the proverbial Epstein papers that were touted by all the Republican or MAGA candidates during the election. We are going to reveal this thing. We are going to reveal this thing and sort of bring down the edifice. Now then, no, there's no list. And the proletariat are understandably upset, but this is because they didn't understand imperialism. Imperialism is a structure, it's not a person. And at the end of the day, the structure is stratified or horizontal. There's an upper stratum, mid stratum, lower stratum. All that. It's not vertical. So the upper stratum is the upper class, right across all political persuasions. It's an economic stratum. It's no longer about birth or being of noble birth, although some of them are of nobility. But this you can find examples of this in so many different countries. Look at the UK. The the Labour Party and the Conservative Party differ only in personnel. How they address the social issues, etc., is no longer different. And when you look at the choices we have in elections, so many of them are people. Even in fact, in Kenya, they're usually even the same people, because unlike other countries, in Kenya, people actually jumping from one party to another is no longer even something people talk much about. It's something you can wake up today and is in the other party and is in the other party. So they're just positionings on they're choosing which door or window to crawl into the palace. But it's not changing anything. So that's how imperialism is working. And the other parts of imperialism are climate change. The whole climate change narrative. Not climate change itself is a serious problem, but the fact that now rich oligarchs in the West are telling peasant farmers in Kenya that you have to keep fewer cows because of climate change, as opposed to his mega factory in the West. Someone flying a private jet is telling a family in a village in Kenya that they should stop cooking with firewood because of climate change. That's the climate imperialism, and its wheels are oiled by this bullshit around carbon trading. I've got a book. I've finished writing a book about it, which should be out later this year. But it connects. It's all connected with capitalism, oligarchy. Kenya should not build factories because of climate change. We have to keep our emissions down so manufacturing can stay in Europe, the Americas, India, China, wherever. That's the narrative. And the UN the UN is now plays into that because it's covered with contradictions. It stands against war in some places and stands for peace in other places. Um, I work in the conservation field, particularly human rights. So you find that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous people's issues is advocating for indigenous people's rights. Yet UNEP, the other branch of UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, is advocating for expansion of national parks into indigenous people's lands. So what bullshit is this? And what we must recognize that the crumbling that's happening, the UN falling into, it's become a joke now, and that so many other organizations, is because of the lifetime of myths. Human myths have a lifetime around 80 years. It 70 to 80 years it unravels, and that's why these things are all crumbling now. And you see leaders, officials all over the world looking around, casting their eyes around, wondering, who is this enemy bringing us down? No, it's just the weight of contradictions that accumulate over a period of around 70 to 80 years becomes too much for the empire which depended on them. And then it collapses under its own weight. I mean, look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, collapsed around early 90s. That was around 70 years or something. China, 1947 to the early 2000s became a capitalist system. The UN is now 80 years old, reached sell by date. It's crumbling under its contradictions. Superpower status. And superpowers, they don't realize that their superpower status or the weaponry, military superpower status, the most harmful thing to them. Imagine when one country is using X hundred billion of dollars to build maybe dams or factories or farm and produce food, etc. And another country has the same amount locked in missiles in underground silos that have missiles that have no use whatsoever to mankind other than to kill. And you can't even use them because the moment you deploy it, you'll destroy even yourself. You've literally dug a hole in the ground and buried your money. You don't need to look for who is crumbling your kingdom. It's those weapons underground that are crumbling your kingdom because mankind has to eat. We need food, we need energy, and all that. We can't afford a useless weapon that costs hundreds of billions of dollars that can't be used for anything. I was shocked at the cost of flying some of these long distance bombers to go and bomb. It's mind boggling, and that's what's happening. These contradictions are now bringing down imperialism in all its forms, and those the future will belong to those who can find their way out of this morass and or who can understand it. That the importance is not who you align with. If you need to buy food, so and so has food, buy it. If you need to buy machinery, so and so has machines, you buy it. If you need to buy computers, so and so has them, you buy it. No, you don't. If you don't want to trade with so and so because so and so doesn't like it, you are lost. You're lost. And we must start with right from the at the highest resolution, where when we work for them, when we conserve the environment, we conserve it here. I plant my trees here because it's good for me, my environment. Yeah, I'm not planting these trees to help some factory polluting a river in Germany offset their carbon footprint. That's bullshit. There are trees here for me. They cannot clean a river polluted in Germany. So let the person in Germany or Europe, wherever, clean his river or his air. And right now, the most precious resources are clean water, clean air, and this is why the climate imperialism is coming. Organizations like Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, and all are taking money from capitalists and using it to annex water resources, forests, etc. in Africa. They're not conservation organizations, they're imperialist organizations. So recognize imperialism wherever it is. I hope those examples help. And then we'll go on to the next part of the series where we look at how it happens in everyday life and the remnants we see. But the more we learn, the better we get at seeing the bullshit for what it is and calling it out. And eventually we'll be in a better place.